Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff on the NewsHour tonight. On the Edge, U.S., European, and Russian leaders hold separate high-level talks in an ongoing attempt to defuse the tensions brought by Russia's aggression toward Ukraine. Then, facing justice, jury selection begins in the federal hate crimes trial of the 3 men convicted of murdering Ahmaud Arbery. And on the front lines, pharmacists struggle to keep up with demand for COVID vaccines and other services amid widespread staffing shortages.
I felt like I was an octopus pulled in 8 different directions, and one of them is having to give vaccines.
All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
It's the little things. The reminders of what's important. It's why Fidelity dedicated advisors are here to help you create a wealth plan. A plan with tax-sensitive investing strategies. Planning focused on tomorrow, while you focus on today. That's the planning effect from Fidelity.
Consumer Cellular, BNSF Railway, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, for more than 50 years advancing ideas and supporting institutions to promote a better world at hewlett.org. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, working to build a more healthy, just, and inclusive future for everyone at czi.org. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
It was a day for diplomacy on the Ukraine crisis, from Washington to Moscow and beyond. All this as more than 100,000 Russian troops mass along the border with Ukraine. Foreign Affairs correspondent Nick Schifrin has followed the events of this busy day.
I'm delighted to have the Chancellor here today.
Across nearly 5,000 miles from the White House to the Kremlin, a day of diplomacy. French President Emmanuel Macron met with Russian President Vladimir Putin and expressed hope that war could be averted. Putin called the talks useful.
Some of his ideas and proposals, about which I think are too early to speak, but I think these ideas could form a basis for our further joint steps.
And new German Chancellor Olaf Scholz met with President Biden. They tried to present a united front.
He has the complete trust of the United States. Germany is one of our most important allies in the world. There is no doubt about Germany's partnership with the United States, none.
It is important that we act together, that we stand together, and that we do what is necessary together.
But the unity rhetoric doesn't match the whole reality. Germany prevents fellow NATO members from sending German ammunition to Ukraine. And Germany refuses to publicly threaten the German-Russian pipeline Nord Stream 2 if Russia invades Ukraine. Germany has indefinitely paused the certification process. The White House wants to use that pause as leverage over Russia. Today, Biden was clear, and Scholz switched to English to try and back him up.
The notion that Nord Stream 2 would go forward with an invasion by the Russians is just not going to happen.
We will be united. We will act together, and we will take all the necessary steps, and all the necessary steps will be done by all of us together.
The U.S. and much of NATO are trying to take military steps to reinforce the alliance. Today, American soldiers, usually based in the U.S., landed in Poland to bolster 1,000 NATO troops already deployed there. European countries are also reinforcing NATO's eastern flank with European jets and European soldiers, all in an attempt to deter any war in Ukraine from expanding into NATO. But the Russians continue to expand their military footprint on NATO and Ukraine's borders. The Ministry of Defense releases video nearly every day of troops practicing the tactics they could use if they invaded Ukraine. U.S. officials tell PBS NewsHour Russia now has nearly 3/4 of what they would need for a full invasion. And U.S. officials say if Russian soldiers did invade, they could inflict catastrophic casualties, including 50,000 civilians, and cause millions to flee. The U.S. also fears that Russian soldiers could capture Kyiv and overthrow the government in a matter of days.
He's in a position now to be able to invade, almost assuming that the ground is frozen above Kyiv. He has the capacity to do that.
And Biden also urged Americans to leave Kyiv.
I think it'd be wise to leave the country. I'm not talking about our diplomatic corps. I'm talking about Americans who are there. I hate to see them get caught in a crossfire.
But nothing is containing Russia's military buildup, even as diplomacy continues. President Macron heads to Kyiv tomorrow. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
In the day's other news, several states moved to end COVID mask mandates in public schools. New Jersey Democratic Governor Phil Murphy announced his state's mandate will expire 1 month from now. He cited declining infections. But Murphy said those who want to continue wearing masks are free to do so.
A district reserves the right to keep something in place. And secondly, I think most importantly, an individual based on their own health reserves that right, and we cannot stigmatize a decision like that.
New Jersey is one of a dozen states with a current mask mandate for schools. Another one, Connecticut, announced today that its requirement will end on February 28th. And Delaware said its mandate will end March 31st. We'll return to this issue later in the program. A second man will plead guilty to plotting to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer over COVID restrictions. In court documents filed today, Caleb Franks said that he and 5 others planned to abduct Whitmer. The FBI arrested the men in 2020 before the plot could be carried out. 4 of them still face trial. The U.S. Supreme Court late today blocked a lower court's order rejecting a Republican-drawn map of congressional districts in Alabama. The 5-4 action means that the new map will govern the November elections. The lower court found the map allows for only 1 majority black district out of 7 in a state where more than a quarter of the population is black. In Madagascar, more than 60,000 people were homeless, with 21 dead after a tropical cyclone struck over the weekend. The cyclone made landfall late Saturday and weakened as it moved southwest across the island nation. Thousands of homes and government buildings lay in ruins, along with crucial rice crops. It was the second tropical cyclone to strike Madagascar this year. Chinese tennis player Peng Shuai has again denied that she accused a Chinese official of sexual assault or that she's in danger. She told a French newspaper that it was all, quote, an enormous misunderstanding. Meanwhile, officials at the International Olympic Committee would not say today if they believe Peng is under duress.
We, as a sports organisation, are doing everything to ensure that she is happy, and I don't think it's up for us to be able to judge in one way, just as it's not for you to judge either in one way or another her position.
The IOC also said that its president, Thomas Bach, had dinner with Peng over the weekend. United Nations experts say North Korea has intensified its cyber stealing from banks and cryptocurrency exchanges. The Associated Press reports that the North stole $400 million in cryptocurrency last year. Investigators say the funds are being used to fund North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. Back in this country, Spotify says that it will go on streaming commentator Joe Rogan's podcast, at least for now. That's after Rogan apologized for using racial slurs. He was already under fire for anti-COVID vaccine comments. Spotify CEO Daniel Ek told employees on Sunday that silencing Rogan is not the answer. He said, quote, "Canceling voices is a slippery slope." On Wall Street, stocks spent the day searching for direction. The Dow Jones Industrial Average ended with a gain of 1 point to close at 35,091. The Nasdaq fell 82 points. The S&P 500 slipped 16. And at the Winter Olympics, a tough day for an American star. Defending gold medalist Mikaela Shiffrin skied off course early in the women's giant slalom and was disqualified. The U.S. did win the silver medal in team figure skating, with Russia taking gold. Still to come on the NewsHour, states lift school mask mandates, intensifying an already heated debate. Tamara Keith and Amy Walter consider the latest political news. We examine the history of one of the nation's first majority Black farming communities, and much more.
This is the PBS NewsHour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
We return now to diplomatic efforts underway to defuse the Russian-generated crisis over Ukraine. Nick Schifrin has the story.
After French President Emmanuel Macron's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin today, what are the prospects for easing tensions? And how are these talks viewed by the rest of Europe? For that, we turn to Heather Conley, president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, which focuses on improving transatlantic relations. She was a State Department official on European affairs during the George W. Bush administration. Heather Conley, welcome back to the NewsHour. So we heard from Vladimir Putin today during his press conference with Emmanuel Macron, and Putin said that some of Macron's ideas could represent future diplomatic steps. Is that the sign that the prospects of a Russian invasion of Ukraine have been lessened?
Nick, it's really unclear. We're not entirely sure what proposals President Macron was bringing to Moscow. He said in an interview before his departure for Moscow that he was looking for a so-called new balance between sovereignty and peace. President Macron has been really investing in his personal relationship with Vladimir Putin. Going back to 2019, he initiated a strategic dialogue. He also is about to run for re-election in April. So President Macron sees a very unique opportunity here to promote a European approach to this crisis. He has been, I think, very disturbed that the United States and Russia were seemingly to manage European affairs over his head, over European heads. So this was a way for President Macron to go directly to Moscow, use that investment over the last several years. But he seems to be very interested in accommodating Russia's concerns about its security guarantees. But he walks a very delicate balance because he also travels to Kyiv tomorrow to talk to the Ukrainian government, but he can't sell out Ukrainian sovereignty. So unclear what those 5 hours of talks produced, but it is clear that Vladimir Putin would like to tease this out. He continues to escalate and flow forces towards the Ukraine border to apply pressure on President Zelensky and his government. Meanwhile, he's trying to tease some divisions within Europe and, of course, potentially some transatlantic divisions if President Macron creates a proposal that, in fact, can't be accepted by other members of the NATO alliance.
Okay, well, you just suggested yourself that Macron feels like the U.S. has gone over Europe's head and that he's trying to, quote, accommodate Putin. That is not what the United States wants right now. So is this moment a moment actually of transatlantic division, of Macron freelancing?
Well, again, we don't have privy to that. We know President Macron did speak with Joe Biden yesterday before his trip, so hopefully there was some conversation. We know certainly that the White House is very interested in de-escalation, in diplomacy. President Biden certainly reaffirmed that after his meeting with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So this is certainly a moment, but again, at what cost? And again, we have other European allies, particularly those allies that border Ukraine, border Belarus, that see this increased military escalation. They are very wary of potentially what President Macron is proposing. So I think we have to be very clear-eyed about what he is able to achieve.
Macron is emphasizing talks between France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine to discuss agreements known as the Minsk Accords from 2014-2015 that focus on trying to reduce violence in eastern Ukraine along the border. And today, President Putin said there was no alternative to those Minsk agreements. So is that format a path toward de-escalation?
Well, that has been a format that unfortunately has not produced diplomatic benefits. In fact, if anything, the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, has been violated every day, repeatedly, since the Minsk agreements were formed. There were some moments of promise of prisoner exchanges, some humanitarian checkpoints to allow citizens to cross between the line of contact. But unfortunately, the Minsk agreement just really hasn't produced. If anything, the way the agreement was sequenced, meaning that the Ukrainian government has to give greater autonomy, decentralization to the occupied territories of eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. The Ukrainian government has to give them basically a vote free or autonomy, and then, only then, can other issues will be addressed. This applies enormous political pressure on the Zelensky government, pressure that he might not be able to survive. And this is in part what the Kremlin wants, between the force accumulation on its borders, the covert hybrid activities inside, and applying a great deal of diplomatic pressure on the Ukrainian government. Vladimir Putin's hoping that this government may topple, and then he could perhaps find another candidate that would be much more supportive in Kiev of Russia's goals and objectives for Ukraine.
Heather Conley, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Canada is facing protests for a second week over vaccine mandates and other COVID restrictions. Trucks and periodic demonstrations have jammed up the country's capital city, Ottawa, often with loud and disruptive honking. This afternoon, a judge granted a 10-day injunction saying truckers must stop that honking. But the larger protests and shutdown continue. Stephanie Tsai has the story.
From Quebec City to Toronto to Ottawa and cities in between, protesters are taking to the streets, blaring horns, waving signs and banners, and condemning Canada's COVID-19 restrictions.
I'm here to denounce that the unvaccinated for 2 years have been shamed and thrown under the bus on the public place. It goes against freedom of speech in Canada.
The protests are now in their 11th day. They initially started as a convoy of cross-border truck drivers demanding an end to vaccine mandates. On Sunday, Ottawa's mayor declared a state of emergency after the so-called Freedom Convoy paralyzed the heart of the capital city. As of January 15th, all truckers entering Canada are required to be fully vaccinated against COVID. The U.S. has a similar mandate. Nearly 80% of Canada's population is fully vaccinated, and Canada's transport minister estimates about 90% of its truck drivers are. But the protests are no longer just about truckers. Other Canadians have joined in, directing rage at Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and strict public health measures that provinces have put in place, including mask mandates and limits on gatherings.
We had enough of all those mandates that has no sense, no scientific evidence. The people are fed up.
Prime Minister Trudeau, who recently tested positive for COVID, has not responded publicly since last week, when he voiced concern that some of the protests have gotten out of hand.
There is always a right to protest peacefully, that I and others will defend fully as part of this democracy. There is not a right to incite violence, to perform acts of violence, or to spew hatred.
Hundreds of protesters have descended on Ottawa alone.
The protests have been incredibly disruptive and continue to impact the safety and well-being of our residents. People have had the opportunity to voice their frustration against government policy, but as the old saying goes, they've worn out their welcome.
The city's police chief called it a siege that he could not manage.
It has to stop, and we are doing everything we can possibly do to stop it. We need more help. We're asking for that help. We're starting to receive that help, but we need more to get this done.
Officers have begun removing the truckers' fuel supplies to try to break up the protest after residents and businesses accuse them of not doing more to restore calm. Meanwhile, signs that the Freedom Convoy movement may be spreading. In the last few weeks, dozens of organized Facebook groups with thousands of members have popped up in support of the Canadian truckers from around the globe. Many voice frustration with their own country's COVID-19 restrictions and express other right-wing populist causes, and some are starting to plan their own rallies. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Stephanie Tsai.
The announcements today by the governors of New Jersey, Connecticut, and Delaware that they will soon end masking mandates in schools make them the latest states to change their approach to COVID. As Amna Nawaz explains, the debate around this has heated up in recent weeks.
Judy, to be clear, the CDC and groups like the American Academy of Pediatrics continue to recommend masking in schools to reduce the spread of COVID, and they say the evidence is clear. But several states have now either rolled back their mandates or are considering doing so. And a number of doctors have published opinion pieces arguing that masks are difficult for kids to use, detrimental to their well-being, and may not prevent infections based on the data in other studies. So far, it is a minority of doctors arguing this, but we're going to hear from one of them tonight who co-wrote a piece in USA Today. Dr. Lucy McBride is an internist in Washington, D.C. She's written columns for USA Today, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and others. She joins me now. Dr. McBride, welcome to the NewsHour. Thanks for being here. In your latest piece, you cite the alarming mental health crisis we've seen among kids in America, the learning loss that we also know is very real, but those, as you note in your piece, are mostly related to school closures and lockdowns and remote learning. On masking specifically, what's the evidence you've seen that shows masking in schools is harmful for kids?
2 years of living in the pandemic has caused a lot of harm to children. And it's difficult to quantify the losses, emotional and social toll that children have faced. But let's also recognize that there's mounting data that our earliest readers have trouble when they don't see faces. So children who are struggling with speech and language delay, children who have English as a second language, and every child who wants to connect with peers, mentors, teachers, it's really time to think about the fact that masks are not a harmless intervention. When we have an intervention like masking as a mandate, it's imperative that we show that the benefits outweigh the risks. Our oath in public health and medicine is first do no harm. And at this watershed moment of the pandemic, where Omicron is starting to recede, it's really time to appropriately balance risks and harms to our lowest risk population, and that's children.
So let me ask you what the CDC will say, because obviously they point to multiple studies. They have put out the most recent data just a few days ago that says masks work. There are advantages to reducing the risk of transmission, to protecting people who wear the masks. And they say, look, schools have not been hotspots in the pandemic because kids have been masking. In counties where there was no mask mandates, they did see outbreaks. So isn't that enough to say to you, let's continue to keep as many kids as we can safe?
Right, and that's why my co-authors and I have dissected these studies again and again. The CDC's studies that they're citing have not controlled for community vaccination rates, and that is a huge variable. We also see that, yes, N95 respirator-type masks certainly can protect the wearer, but the data on cloth masks is weak, and again, we just don't have real-world studies to show that masking kids in schools helps reduce transmission.
So let me ask you about vaccinations then, because it is a key part of this argument. We know that the uptake among younger kids in particular is very low. It's only about 22% of kids age 5 to 11 are fully vaccinated. So before schools get rid of masks or mask mandates, do you recommend that they require vaccines?
I don't recommend that we tie unmasking to vaccination. However, It's important that parents recognize the vaccines are extraordinarily safe and effective and widely available. So as a doctor and as a mother myself, I do recommend vaccination, particularly for children at highest risk for poor outcomes from COVID-19. And if that child is particularly high risk and is still hesitant about the vaccine, you can mask that child with an N95 respirator type mask. Remember though, the risk of COVID-19 to most healthy children is very, very low and on par with influenza. It's not the same virus, but the risk is similar enough, and the risk is dropping as Omicron disease prevalence drops locally.
Let me ask you about some of the concerns others have raised about the messaging, about the significance of COVID among children. Some people worry it's been underplayed to some degree. And we spoke recently to Dr. Yvonne Maldonado. She's a pediatric infectious disease professor at Stanford. Here's what she had to say about that messaging.
Tens of thousands of children have been hospitalized. More recently with Omicron, we have been overrun with hospitalizations. We know that there have been over 1,000 children who have died. And again, not to make light of that number, we know that adults have died in many higher numbers, but that is not a reason to allow children to die unnecessarily.
Dr. McBride, it's absolutely true. More adults have died. Total deaths among kids 0 to 17, now total over 1,200. And it's different when you talk about child deaths. So what would you say to Dr. Maldonado?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because every death of a child is tragic, no matter what the cause. We should not be minimizing the trauma and loss to families who've lost a child to COVID-19. We also know in 2022 exactly how to protect those high-risk children. We vaccinate them, we boost them if they're particularly high risk, like the adolescents who have obesity or underlying cardiac conditions or who are on immune suppressant medications, and we vaccinate the adults around them. Protecting unvaccinated children, like the under 5s, is best done by vaccinating adults around them. In other words, we need to think broadly about protecting populations. So as the World Health Organization says in their constitution, health is not simply the absence of disease or infirmity. It is a state of mental, social, emotional, and physical health. And it's not easy in these very, very complicated times to balance all of those risks. But right now, masking children in schools when masks are not clearly reducing transmission is not the way to save those lives of those vulnerable children or vulnerable adults.
I have a feeling this is a conversation we're going to be having for quite some time to come. Dr. Lisa McBride, I'm grateful to you for joining us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Pharmacists and pharmacy workers have gotten far less attention than other healthcare workers during this pandemic, but the stress and the pressure they face has been intense. Just weeks ago, as Omicron was surging and many staff were getting sick, major pharmacy chains and independent stores had to reduce their hours, even close down at times. While that immediate situation has improved, staffing shortages and working conditions have been a problem throughout the pandemic. Moreover, pharmacy technicians earn very little. Here is some of what we heard from pharmacists themselves.
Hello, my name is Dr. Blair Tanaway. I am a pharmacist. I used to work for a major chain and pharmacy here in Oklahoma City. Now I work inpatient as a pharmacist.
My name is David Hale. I'm an overnight pharmacist working for one of the large national retail chains, and I've been a pharmacist for about 7 years now.
Hello, my name is Dr. Lonnie Duong. I'm a clinical pharmacist in California.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jennifer Morrow. I'm a pharmacist, and up until December 2021, I was working at CVS Pharmacy as a pharmacy manager.
My name is Ryan, and I currently live in Delaware, and I've been a pharmacist now since 2004, so 17 years. We've had a lot of influx of new customers, a lot more responsibilities, such as COVID testing, sanitation procedures to keep everything safe for not only ourselves, but for the public. A lot more questions from the public. That means a lot more phone calls. We are also doing the vaccinations, which have become a huge challenge to try to incorporate into our normal workflow of just being a pharmacist.
Having maybe think about 30 or 40 vaccines on top of your daily work with the same amount of people for my store was overwhelming. I felt that I was not living up to the oath that I took as a pharmacist to take care of my patients, but also to take care of my staff.
Pharmacists are capable of every job that we've been given and even more. We're trained to help people self-diagnose so that they can get the right over-the-counter medication, or if it's time to go seek further medical help, we're capable of giving all these vaccines. I'm just not capable of doing it all at the same time.
The burden that we put upon ourselves as healthcare providers is that we want to provide the best care for our patients. But with an increased workload and not being adequately staffed, if we are forced to work quicker, I'm more worried that I'm going to miss something for one of my patients.
Because pharmacists are getting sick as well, we've been asked to pick up extra shifts whenever possible. We've had pharmacists that have had to come to work while sick because they haven't been able to find anybody to cover their shift.
If you had a doctor working on a loved one or a family member performing surgery, would you want the phone ringing in the background while the doctor's providing surgery to your loved one? You want that doctor having questions thrown at them, having the drive-through being rung, having emails pop up at you, having customers waving at you. So it's challenging.
I felt like I was an octopus pulled in 8 different directions, and one of them is having to give vaccines. Now I'm even concerned I might give the wrong vaccine at the wrong time. Like, the white coat that I would wear became so heavy to put on every day in the fear that I might be a danger to my patients instead of that safety net that they need.
My decision to leave my old company completely was because I was afraid to harm my patients and realized that it was not coming back if I had made a mistake that was truly monumental and that was going to hurt someone.
Just the idea of going to work, I start to feel physically ill to the stomach, back pain. And I do believe that's from the anxiety and stress of having to go back into the fray, so to speak.
I think what our world right now needs, as much as this vaccine to help us get through the pandemic, is patience and understanding that every single one of us are being affected. Your pharmacists, your pharmacy technicians, your Uber drivers, your Door Dashers, your post office workers, your doctors. Everyone is being affected by this. We understand your frustration, but when you come in and see someone behind the counter working for you, try to smile and be appreciative that that person's there for you.
And we appreciate each one of those pharmacists speaking with us. And this note, CVS and Walgreens announced increases in pay last year for technicians who earn around $35,000 a year or less. And the major chains say they are trying to hire more people and offer bonuses. But pharmacy workers say they need more significant changes in hours, working conditions, and even better pay. Jury selection began today in the federal hate crimes trial for 3 white men in Georgia already convicted in state court of murdering Ahmaud Arbery, who was black. William Brangham has the story.
Judy, last month, Travis McMichael, Greg McMichael, and William Roddy Bryan were sentenced in a Georgia state court to life in prison for chasing down and murdering Arbery. The federal trial will look at whether the killings were racially motivated, which wasn't addressed in the state case. The Justice Department has charged the 3 men with hate crimes and attempted kidnapping. Deval Patrick used to prosecute these types of cases as the former Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights under Bill Clinton. He's also the former governor of Massachusetts and now co-chairs American Bridge 21st Century, which is a Democratic Party organization. Deval Patrick, very good to have you back on the NewsHour. So the DOJ is prosecuting this as a hate crime. And is it my understanding that the prosecutors then have to prove that these defendants had racist beliefs in their heart when they committed this murder?
That motivated the murder, and there's evidence of this in this case, and that in itself has been deemed a federal interest deserving of punishment.
So is it your sense that if the state prosecutors had introduced a potential racist motivation for this killing, that the Department of Justice might not have been interested in pursuing this?
You know, it's such an interesting question, and I'll bet it's the very kind of question that the department struggled with, because to some extent, the racial animus in the state trial, which was a straight prosecution for murder, is not relevant. It's additional color, but it doesn't make it, it's not outcome determinative, if you will, William. These are difficult cases in that sense, but they're important ones to bring because of, as I was saying earlier, the federal interest expressed in this legislation to punish racially motivated criminal behavior. And that is what this was. There was evidence of it available to state prosecutors, but they made a judgment not to use it because I'm inferring because it wasn't necessary to prove the case that was before the state court and jury.
But help me understand the concern some viewers might have, which is these three men have been prosecuted for murder. They're all going to go away for life in prison. So what is the importance of bringing a separate case that may not add anything to their prison time?
Well, it's not just about adding to their prison time, although sometimes it is. In this case, apparently not. But it's also making it clear that we are going to care about and we are going to enforce that federal interest in racially motivated violence. And that has been an issue in this country for a long, long time. Getting these laws on the books was a struggle for a long, long, long time. And you can imagine how the situations go. You know, sometimes, let's just suppose that the decision had gone the other way in the state court, and the defendants had been acquitted. Will they then be arguing that the federal prosecution shouldn't go forward?
You prosecuted a bunch of these types of cases when you were in the Department of Justice. Are these tough cases to prove the motivating intent behind a crime?
Yes, you know, beyond the fact that there is intention, a lot of times the juries don't want to hear about the racism behind it. That's been true for a long, long time. You know, let's just deal with the consequences, not let's deal with the reasons for the motivation, and that's been a blind spot, if you will, for a long time in this country. These cases are really hard. They aren't, at least when I was there, and I think still today, they aren't pursued lightly. They aren't pursued often. And there is a deference to state courts to see whether state authorities are going to take the action, and federal authorities don't have to bring a case that's quite as close. For example, William, I can understand in this case why it is the federal prosecutor tried to reach a plea agreement. I can understand it. I can also understand why Mr. Arbery's mother said no.
This was the plea agreement that they had, the men had said, we will plead guilty and admit that we had racial animus in our minds and hearts when we committed the crime. The judge threw out that plea.
Correct. Very, very unusual, William, to have the defendants not just agree to the plea, but agree to admit to the racial animus. Very unusual. As I understand it, the counsel for the family at least initially indicated a willingness to support the deal. But when Mrs. Arbery learned that they would be serving their term in a federal prison, which is not a comfortable place, but a lot better facility than the state facility, she said no, and the judge accepted that.
All right, Deval Patrick, former Massachusetts governor and former member of the Department of Justice. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, William.
As the Republican Party prepares for the midterm elections this year, the January 6th assault on the Capitol and the subsequent investigation continue to loom large. The Republican National Committee issued a stunning rebuke of two of its own last week, censuring Representatives Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger for their work on the Congressional Committee investigating the Capitol attack. The censure resolution referred to the events as, quote, ordinary citizens engaged in legitimate political discourse. The RNC letter later said that they were not defending those who violently stormed the Capitol, but the comments still sparked outcry from some in the party, including Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski, who wrote, "We must not legitimize those actions which resulted in loss of life, and we must learn from that horrible event." Here to help us understand the political effect of all this and more, I'm joined by our Politics Monday duo. That's Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter and Tamara Keith of NPR. Hello to both of you. Very good to have you, the two of you, back together again. Tam, I'm going to start with you and what the RNC had done at its last meeting. What are the political consequences of making this statement, issuing this censure? What kind of effect could this have on Republican candidates running for office this year?
Well, at the very least, that statement was political malpractice or communications malpractice. They used a phrase that can be used against them. Now, whether that phrase will continue to be salient in November, it's not clear at this point, but it is part of this broader thing that's happening where they censured two Republican members, the only two Republican members of the January 6th commission or committee at the same time that they also did this resolution. And it's in line with this idea that if you are against Trump, then you're not a real Republican. And former President Trump, anyone who criticizes him calls them a rhino, Republican in name only, which really speaks to the idea that to be Republican, you have to be loyal to President Trump.
So, Amy, where does that leave Republican candidates across the board this year?
As Tam pointed out, you can't. I mean, you can, but if it's not very politically smart for a Republican up for election this year to criticize Donald Trump or to in any way get on his radar, because he will want retribution for that. So what we'll see is something like we saw this weekend from Senator Marco Rubio. He's up for re-election this year. He was asked about these very comments, Judia, over the weekend. And what you saw him do was to say, well, of course, somebody like Mike Pence shouldn't have been able to overturn the election because I don't want to see somebody like Kamala Harris, nor should other Republicans want to see someone like Kamala Harris making sure that Joe Biden wins re-election. We don't want to empower a vice president because that would mean empowering the other side. Also saying, of course, legitimate discourse is different from what happened with violent attacks, but that wasn't everybody who was there on January 6th, and then bringing it back to Democrats. But let's remember this January 6th commission is illegitimate, is a political sideshow. So doing everything they can to put Republicans, that is, to walk this tightrope, not saying I agree with Donald Trump, but being able to instead put the onus back on Democrats, try not to focus so much on Trump and the 2020 election, try to make it a lot more about Democrats and about delegitimizing the January 6th commission in and of itself.
And when it comes to that January 6th committee, Tam, we've watched them for weeks, for months now, trying to get information, trying to get people to cooperate. And then it seems we learn something almost every other day about former President Trump's efforts to stymie this, that he has been tearing up. We had seen reporting of this, but now we see even more detail about how the former president just ripped up documents that could be important for the investigation that they're doing.
Document preservation was never a priority for the Trump administration. One might argue that destroying documents and using private phones for the public's business was part of the system of operation in the Trump White House. They were reminded repeatedly, reprimanded for not staying in line with the Presidential Records Act, and they kept doing it. And so, in some ways, what we're hearing from the January 6th committee about documents taped back together is confirmation of something that was reported very early in the Trump presidency about his tendency to just tear up documents. You also know that when he was in business, he didn't use email. He tried not to have a paper trail. And so this is sort of par for the course for Trump. The thing that I would say that is more detrimental to the committee's work is that there are people close to Trump who are absolutely refusing to cooperate, either refusing to testify or taking the fifth to protect themselves.
Committee is plowing ahead, Amy, but it seems, as we said, almost every other day, there's news that they're not getting cooperation where they need it.
That's fair, but they also have gotten a lot of information. They have texts, they have documents. They do have a lot of people who have come either because they were subpoenaed or willingly came in and gave testimony. So when you listen to what some of the committee members are saying, at least on the record, is we've got a lot of stuff here. There's a lot we can do with it. But at the end of the day, when it comes to things like the preservation of records or whether there was any criminal behavior on the part of the former president, that's something that has to be referred to the DOJ. And of course, we have another case going on, Judy, down in Atlanta in Fulton County, where a special grand jury there is looking into those allegations about the president, really pushing on the Secretary of State and other officers, election officers in that state, to quote unquote find some votes for Donald Trump after the election was over.
And some very serious legal consequences depending
Correct.
on what happens there. Just very quickly to both of you, Tam, President Biden, some commentators are saying and that with the start of a new year, with good jobs numbers and a few other pieces of news, maybe there's an opportunity for the president to get a political reset and improve his fortunes?
The thing is, you get a couple of small wins, even small ones, and you start to have a winning record. And in particular, that jobs report that came out on Friday was very good news for President Biden. It included revisions of previous months that had caused everyone to say, oh gosh, the recovery is lagging, when in fact, it turns out job growth was strong. And there's been something of a decoupling of job growth and jobs and the economy from the Omicron variant, which is different from previous waves of the coronavirus. So that is good news for President Biden.
And Amy, precedent for a president being able to turn his fortunes around?
Well, Judy, the polling is, and the precedent in polling is not that good for President Biden. At least in modern times, we haven't seen a president substantially improve his standing with voters between January and November of an election year. But this president has two challenges. One is to get his base more motivated and more engaged. And I think the January 6th committee, as well as the Supreme Court nomination, that can potentially help to motivate his base. And then the big challenge, of course, is independent voters. They were much more receptive to the president. They were much, they saw him in a much better light earlier in his presidency, and that spring and summer when things were going better. But now, between inflation and COVID and the economy, they've really soured on him. Those things need to be able to turn around in order for him to win those voters back, or for Democrats to win those voters back in 2022 midterms.
Those independent voters, we just keep watching them.
We do.
Amy Walter, Tamara Keith, thank you both. Politics Monday.
You're welcome.
They were, yeah. The wave of migration across the United States in the mid-1800s included people looking to live in open spaces with land to grow crops and the opportunity to have a better life. After the Civil War, that included freed slaves and their families. Fred DeSam Lazaro has the story of one Kansas town that was established as a result. It's part of our Black History Month coverage and our ongoing series, Race Matters.
The Kansas plains are filled with the lore of pioneers who, in the mid-1800s, laid the foundation of what would become America's breadbasket. Less well known is the smaller wave of newcomers for whom the journey meant something more.
It really represents African American experience in the West, leaving war-torn, volatile Jim Crow South and coming to experience real freedom.
Historian Angela Bates's ancestors were among an exodus of freed slaves who left the South in the years following the Civil War. Nicodemus was one of several all-black settlements that sprung up across the U.S.
It was a dream before even Martin Luther King was born. And so it was a dream that actually became a reality.
Despite grinding poverty and a harsh climate, Bates says they forged a community here.
It was a hard life building a town here, right?
It was for any pioneer, no matter what color you were. But for the African American that had endured slavery, I say it was easier. They had a choice. And so even though the hardships of living in holes in the ground, which were called dugouts, that was better than living in an environment where you had no choice.
By the early 1880s, Nicodemus had a population of about 500. It had a bank, a post office, and several businesses, and was poised for more growth, anticipating that the railroad would soon come through, the equivalent in those days of a town being hooked up to the internet for the first time. Alas, the railroad decided to lay its rails just a few miles to the south of this town.
As soon as the railroad bypasses your town, your economic viability is definitely in question. And then Nicodemus started to decline.
That was the fate of other all-black towns, most absorbed into larger municipalities or simply abandoned as residents migrated in search of work. For those who stayed on here in the decades that followed, life was a struggle, as it was for black farmers across the country, who were largely excluded from critical government lending and price support programs.
So all this prairie land, all this farmland here was black owned at one point.
At one point, all of it.
And now?
Maybe about 10% of it.
Johnella Holmes is director of the Kansas Black Farmers Association.
You know, most of them that had to give up their land and their farm, they didn't walk away with a nest egg.
What is the condition of black farmers today?
Dismal. They're still losing acres. They're still walking away from their farming. The parents are no longer encouraging the children to go ahead and assume the debt and, and continue to farm.
Much of Nicodemus lies in ruin today, but for Holmes and others who call themselves descendants, there's something special about this place. That's why Holmes moved back after retiring from her job at Kansas State University.
Both my parents grew up here.
Angela Bates grew up in Pasadena, California, but like her parents, felt the tug.
And so when they moved away, they always came back because this is home. Home being our own all-black town, and very proud of that.
In the 90s, Bates led a campaign that successfully designated Nicodemus as a National Historic Site, memorializing the little-known black pioneer experience. As schoolchildren come on field trips and others gather for annual homecoming days held in the summer, they get a different take on black history.
Too often, we look at slavery, and as we look back, all we see are the atrocities. But out of that came great things. It created greatness in people and tenacity in people. And so what they were doing out here on the isolated high plains of Kansas was phenomenal. I'm proud of that legacy. It runs in my veins, and it just makes me feel that the world needs to know the story.
Out of a history defined by struggle, Bates says she wants to create a future that can inspire hope. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Fred DeSam Lazaro in Nicodemus, Kansas.
Such important history, and Fred's reporting is a partnership with the Undertold Stories Project at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. And on the NewsHour Online, nearly 6 months after a mass evacuation of Afghans into the United States and elsewhere, many local organizations are stretching their resources to provide jobs, housing, food, and other needs for the thousands of evacuees in need. You can read about how they're meeting those challenges at pbs.org/newshour. And that's the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Judy Woodruff. Join us online and again here tomorrow evening. For all of us at the PBS NewsHour, thank you. Please stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by...
For 25 years, Consumer Cellular's goal has been to provide wireless service that helps people communicate and connect. We offer a variety of no-contract plans, and our U.S.-based customer service team can help find one that fits you. To learn more, visit consumercellular.tv.
BNSF Railway. The Kendeda Fund, committed to advancing restorative justice and meaningful work through investments in transformative leaders and ideas. More at kendedafund.org. Supported by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, committed to building a more just, verdant, and peaceful world. More information at macfound.org. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.